Today, we travel to Busan, South Korea, to a late evening in May 2023. It was a time when this bustling port city was slipping into the quiet rhythm of the early morning hours. As the last remaining taxis thinned out, giving way to the peaceful rest of its residents, but within just a few hours, a desolate stretch of road along the Nakdong River would become the focal point of an international true crime investigation, one that shocked the world due to the absolute deviation of human behavior. It was a crime devoid of conflict, free of financial motive, leaving only the chilling vacuum of a modern criminal mind. In today's story, we will trace a fateful suitcase at 3 in the morning, dissect the meticulous layers of deception in the interrogation room, and uncover what truly happened behind the closed doors of digital isolation. We often believe that the monstrous will announce itself with a visible tear in the fabric of daily life. We expect a conspicuous shadow, a sudden shift in the air, or at the very least, a clear warning sign in someone's behavior. But when reality fractures, it usually begins with the utterly ordinary. A familiar transaction, a routine route, a passenger stepping into the back seat of a sedan on a quiet, midnight street. At around 3 o'clock in the morning on May 27, 2023, a veteran taxi driver pulled over in central Busan to pick up a young woman. She was petite, wearing round-rimmed glasses and dragging a large wheeled suitcase that seemed exceptionally heavy. Her requested destination was an isolated, unlit stretch of road near the Nakdong River, a location with absolutely no residential value, no commercial activity, and no logical reason for a traveller to visit at dawn. The journey passed in absolute silence. There was no panicked breathing, no restless movements, and none of the rushing adrenaline typical of a fugitive on the run. Yet, the moment the driver lifted the suitcase out of the trunk at the drop-off point, his hands registered a bizarre, unsettling physical paradox. The bag was massive, but its center of gravity shifted with a strange, fluid density. When he withdrew his hand under the dim cabin light, his fingers were smeared with a dark, sticky substance. It was fresh blood. But let's look at the actual context of that moment. It's 3 in the morning, in a dark and completely isolated area. The driver is facing a petite girl who looks completely harmless, like a university student. Discovering blood on a suitcase is terrifying. But what would a normal person naturally assume first? A chaotic medical emergency? A tragic accident, or perhaps a strange youth transporting raw meat from the market? Why would the immediate reaction be to call the police about a murder? That is exactly what makes this opening moment so fragile and ambiguous. A strange piece of luggage or an unusual destination is never enough to confirm a crime on its own. If the girl had panicked, burst into tears, or offered a rushed explanation about an accident, the driver might have simply driven away, rationalizing the blood as an unfortunate mishap. But what completely shattered his baseline trust wasn't the fluid on his hands, it was her absolute, unnatural silence. She offered no explanation. She did not seek help. Instead, she calmly dragged the heavy suitcase away from the car and walked straight into the dark riverbank brush. Operating with the cold composure of someone who believed the darkness would erase all traces. Guided by a sharp survival instinct, the driver did not return to his route. He parked at the nearest lit intersection and dialed emergency services. Within less than 30 minutes, rapid response units intercepted the young woman as she wandered near the river. When officers forced the suitcase open, the facade of the innocent student instantly collapsed. Inside was the dismembered upper torso of a human body. Hidden nearby in the weeds were trash bags containing the victim's phone, identification cards, and specialized tools used to dissect the body. As the sun rose over Busan, Detectives realized they were not dealing with a gangland disposal or a professional underworld hit. The suspect was 23-year-old Jung Yoo-jung, a woman with no prior criminal record, no history of violence, and no connection to any criminal organization. Yet, as she sat on the cold metal chair of Interrogation Room 3, her heart rate remained perfectly steady. She looked at the blood splattered on her clothes, not with horror, but with a detached, almost clinical curiosity. The physical horror by the river was undeniable, but the true unease was just beginning to surface within her digital history, where investigators discovered that this entire execution had been mapped out months in advance, hidden behind the veneer of a completely ordinary life. To understand how Jung Yoo-jung ended up on that desolate riverbank, investigators had to look past the physical boundaries of the crime scene and step into the digital space, a realm we trust and use every single day. In modern society, we routinely open our doors to strangers through mobile applications, operating under an invisible umbrella of mutual trust. In mid-May 2023, Jung weaponized that very trust to orchestrate a chillingly calculated home invasion through a popular tutoring matching app in South Korea. Jung created a fraudulent profile. She didn't register as a tutor looking for work, nor did she pose as a student seeking knowledge. Instead, she played the role of a mother looking for an English tutor for her middle school child. It was a deeply calculated choice of identity, designed to exploit a severe structural vulnerability in the platform's security framework. The app maintained incredibly strict verification protocols for educators to list their services. Tutors had to submit university transcripts, national identity cards, and criminal background checks to ensure student safety. But for clients, those playing the role of parents, the verification threshold was practically non-existent. Anyone with a burner phone number could create an account, browse the public registry of verified teachers, and locate exactly where they lived. Jung scrolled through this vulnerable directory until she found her target. A prestigious university student, known to the public under the pseudonym Hannah. Hannah was a passionate and dedicated educator when Jung approached her, spinning desperate lies about her child needing urgent academic support. Hannah initially hesitated due to the geographical distance, but Jung pressed harder, exploiting the young tutor's professional empathy until Hannah agreed to host the session right inside her own apartment. Once the trap was sprung, Jung finalized the physical mechanics of her deception. She visited a second-hand store to purchase a middle school uniform. At 23, with a petite frame and youthfully sharp facial features, Jung knew the uniform would serve as a perfect visual camouflage. It allowed her to bypass the gaze of neighbors and building security, blending into the residential landscape like a child on her way to class. So, is this genuinely a case of premeditated murder? Or could it have been a chaotic extortion plot that spiraled out of control? Creating a fake parent profile and buying an old uniform sounds bizarre, but it feels like the reckless, desperate robbery attempt of a youth that turned violent the moment she entered the room. Why are we asserting from the very beginning that her objective was absolute execution? Because the forensic footprints left behind allow for no speculation of an unintended escalation. Digital data analysis later revealed that Jung wasn't just searching for tutoring apps. Since February 2023, she had spent months feeding search engines highly specialized queries regarding how to kill a person, weapon selection, and methods for completely concealing a corpse. The uniform was not a tool for extortion. It was a tactical arrangement to secure absolute physical advantage. On the evening of May 26, 2023, at around 6 p.m., Jung arrived at Hannah's apartment complex wearing the school uniform. She knocked on the door, crossed the threshold, and instantly verified a crucial piece of information. Hannah was entirely alone. Just seconds after entering, the childish disguise vanished. Jung drew a concealed knife and launched a brutal assault, targeting the victim's neck. This was not an isolated tragedy born from a spontaneous argument. It was a systemic failure of digital guardianship. Hannah had opened her door to protect a child's future. Instead, she let in a phantom one who had spent months planning to erase her existence. And as the apartment door locked from the inside, the horror was only beginning. What happens in the immediate aftermath of an extreme act of violence usually follows a frantic psychological script. Panic, rushing, the overwhelming urge to flee the scene, or a crushing realization of what has been done. But as investigators began reconstructing the hours following Hannah's death, they confronted a behavioral pattern that departed entirely from criminal norms, entering the realm of pure, detached anomaly. After the assault was over, Jung Yoo-jung did not run. Instead, she chose to stay inside the victim's apartment for hours. Lingering in the quiet space, she casually raided Hannah's closet, sorting through her belongings before selecting a change of clothes, including a personal jacket belonging to the woman she had just killed. Leaving the crime scene under the cover of darkness, Jung made multiple trips to local convenience stores and supermarkets. Security cameras captured her navigating the aisles with complete composure, selecting large trash bags, multiple bottles of bleach, and additional knives to facilitate the next stage of her plan. And then there is the footage that would eventually transfix and terrify an entire nation. As Jung walked down a public sidewalk, dragging the large wheeled suitcase she would later use to transport the remains, her body language wasn't weighed down by fear or adrenaline. She was literally skipping. Her head bobbed, her steps were light and buoyant, displaying a joyful, carefree elasticity that looked like a child walking home from an amusement park. If that is true, if she was genuinely skipping and playing dress-up in the victim's clothes, it feels less like a calculating criminal mastermind and more like a complete, sudden psychological detachment from reality. Rhythmic skipping and wandering around a crime scene feel deeply erratic. Couldn't this buoyant behaviour actually be the evidence of an acute psychotic break, where her brain simply fractured under the trauma of an escalated argument? That explanation completely unravels when placed against the cold, anatomical reality of the physical evidence. Forensic analysis established that the strikes to Hannah's neck were not wild, defensive, or chaotic. They were highly focused and lethally targeted, matching the specific search terms Jung had been feeding into her phone for months. Furthermore, her digital footprints during those exact hours showed zero cognitive confusion. She wasn't experiencing a disorienting break from reality. She was systematically executing a body concealment strategy she had meticulously studied since February. Criminal psychologists who analysed the footage noted that Jung's bouncing gait pointed away from panic and directly toward a profound emotional detachment. She wasn't rushing because in her mind the crisis wasn't the murder was the achievement. Changing into the victim's clothes and lounging in her apartment suggests she wasn't just hiding a crime, she was actively absorbing and relishing the identity of the person she had destroyed. When the taxi driver's quick thinking brought her journey to a sudden halt just hours later, investigators expected her to crack under the weight of the physical evidence inside that suitcase. But as she sat down in the interrogation room, still wearing a mask of total calm, Jung proved that her performance was far from over. She was about to unleash a frantic, evolving sequence of cinematic fabrications designed to test the absolute limits of police credulity. When cornered by undeniable physical evidence, a guilty mind usually searches for an exit built on logic. But Jung Yoo-jung did not operate within normal parameters. Faced with a bloody suitcase and a victim's identification card, she turned the interrogation into a theatre of deception, rapidly spinning a sequence of wild cinematic fabrications to see which narrative might shield her from accountability. Her first cover story was as shocking as it was desperate. Jung looked directly at the detectives and claimed that the dismembered remains inside the luggage belonged to her own secret newborn child. She insisted she had suffered an acute postpartum psychotic break, lost control, and was simply trying to hide the body out of sheer maternal terror. It was an intense, emotionally charged narrative designed to elicit immediate evolutionary sympathy and shift her legal categorization from a cold-blooded killer to a broken medical victim. But science dismantled the theatre instantly. Medical forensics conducted an immediate physical examination of Jung, looking for the indelible biological markers that pregnancy and childbirth leave on a woman's body. The results were definitive. She had never been pregnant. The newborn baby was an absolute phantom, a fiction invented on the spot. Without skipping a beat, Jung abandoned the phantom child and pivoted to an entirely new script. This time, she claimed she was an innocent bystander caught in a vast, dangerous criminal web. She told investigators that a shadow syndicate had murdered the young woman in an elaborate identity theft plot. Jung claimed she was merely a helpless delivery pawn, threatened and hired by these invisible figures solely to dispose of the suitcase in exchange for stealing the victim's life. Even if the syndicate story is a total lie, it contains a terrifying shred of psychological truth. We know from the digital forensic log that Jung was deeply obsessed with the thriller film Helpless, a movie where a desperate woman literally murders a stranger to completely steal her identity. Couldn't this crime genuinely have been an identity theft plot that went wrong inside the room? Just like the movie. That is exactly what Jung wanted everyone to believe, but prominent criminal psychologists saw right through the cinematic parallel. They discovered that Jung hadn't acted out the movie. She was using the movie as an alibi architecture. She had studied the plot of Helpless ahead of time to intentionally construct a complex, dramatic fiction she could feed to the police if she ever got caught. It was a defensive strategy designed to cloud her real tracks with a carefully scripted media trope, ensuring that even her backup plan relied on fiction. When both narratives collapsed under forensic scrutiny, Jung resorted to physical distraction. During intense questioning, she suddenly doubled over, faking severe, agonizing stomach pains and demanding immediate medical intervention. She was rushed to a local hospital under armed guard, stalling the investigation for hours until medical staff ran diagnostic tests and exposed her symptoms as another complete fabrication. Jung's mind was a chameleon, adapting and shifting from a grieving mother to a coerced syndicate pawn to a medical patient in crisis. But every single line out of her mouth was a calculated performance, designed to evade legal reality. As her options finally ran out and her fabrications lay completely spent, investigators realized that traditional interrogation techniques would never break her. To get to the truth, they would have to bring in the one person who could shatter her emotional wall. The man who had dedicated his entire life to protecting her. Behind every anomalous act of violence, we naturally search for a ruptured home, a broken domestic engine that can explain the birth of a predator. We look for overt cruelty, systemic neglect, or a history of abuse to restore order to our understanding of human behavior. But as investigators dug into the private life of Jung Yoo-jung, they found a reality that was infinitely more tragic. They found an elderly grandfather who had spent decades pouring absolute devotion, shelter, and care into an emotional void. Jung's grandfather was her sole legal guardian, having raised her entirely on his own after early parental abandonment left her isolated from the world. He had sheltered her through years of chronic joblessness, quietly bought her groceries, and continuously funded her life while she claimed to be studying for her future. Now, he was called into the cold, sterile confines of the Busan police station to confront the entity his sanctuary had inadvertently hidden. Sitting across from her, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound grief and moral duty, the old man did not offer a defensive shield or a legal excuse. Instead, he begged her to confess. He implored her to strip away the cinematic alibis and face reality, if only to preserve a single shred of human integrity before it was too late. Under the weight of her grandfather's tears, Jung Yoo-jung's calculated defenses finally fractured. She looked at him and delivered her ultimate, unvarnished confession. There was no mention of a phantom child, no shadow syndicate, no sudden argument that escalated out of control. She simply said, "I just wanted to experience murder. I wanted to know what it feels like." The confession sent shockwaves through the nation, but the heaviest toll was carried by the man who had raised her. On June 2, 2023, as Jung was formally transferred to the prosecution, her grandfather stepped before the national media. He didn't make excuses. Weeping openly, he looked into the cameras and said, "I feel really sorry for the bereaved family because I'm a sinner who raised my granddaughter wrong." It is impossible not to feel a crushing weight watching that old man take the blame. His willingness to pull the truth out of her shows a deep moral compass. But if she finally confessed when faced with his grief, doesn't that suggest there was still a lingering spark of familial respect or genuine internal remorse inside her? A sign that she wasn't completely devoid of human empathy. We desperately want to look for that spark to make the world feel safe, to believe that even the darkest minds answer to love. But her subsequent actions completely dismantled any illusion of remorse. When led past reporters during her public transfer, Jung casually parroted mechanical media scripts, flatly apologizing to the victim's family before chillingly uttering a polite thank you to the press corps. Later, inside her holding cell, prison records revealed that she ate heartily and slept perfectly soundly, demonstrating the serene, unbothered baseline of someone who felt absolutely no internal emotional reckoning. The true cost of this ignored preventability was a massive cascading cultural rupture. Across South Korea, an entire generation of independent tutors, realizing how easily their secure homes had been mapped by a predator, deleted their online profiles overnight. A dedicated civilian taxi driver, traumatized by the physics of that midnight suitcase, walked away from his vehicle and abandoned his career entirely, out of sheer psychological terror. The grandfather had given her a lifetime of protection, only to receive a legacy of absolute social shame and psychological ruin in return. He internalizes her pathology as his own educational failure, while a terrified society is left to wonder what kind of hidden anatomy breeds a mind like this. Because as Jung Yoo-jung's psychological evaluations were finalized, forensics uncovered a diagnostic score that didn't just place her outside the norm, it redefined our understanding of modern digital isolation. When the public trial phases ended and the headlines began to quiet, investigators were left with a digital corpse of a life. They had to look into the absolute void, where Jung Yoo-jung's history should have been. We live in an era where everyone leaves a continuous, chaotic digital wake-likes, threads, groups, messages. But when forensic specialists extracted the data from Jung's phone, they found a chilling, absolute vacuum. Her phone logs from 2023 revealed an absolute digital cell. 0 real-world contacts, 0 incoming text messages from friends, colleagues, or acquaintances. For 5 long years, Jung had completely vanished from the physical world.
shut away inside her bedroom under the pretense of studying for a public official exam. It was a massive, carefully maintained deception to secure continuous financial support from her grandfather while she slipped deeper into a sterile, unmonitored electronic existence.
When detectives tracked down her former high school classmates, hoping to find a history of trauma or targeted bullying to explain her path, they found nothing. Her classmates didn't hate her. They didn't even remember her. She was completely ignored, a non-entity who actively chose to sit entirely silent behind classroom curtains, eating snacks alone, completely avoiding the human architecture around her. But as her secondary forensic psychological evaluations were finalized, experts realized that this quiet, invisible phantom harbored an internal state of staggering malice. Her initial psychopathy checklist evaluation yielded a baseline score of 15. But upon secondary deep diagnostic testing by state forensic psychologists, her score spiked to a staggering 28. This metric placed her squarely above some of the most notorious serial killers in modern global history, shattering any attempt to classify her as a standard product of social neglect. Looking at those empty phone logs and those 5 years spent in absolute isolation, it's profoundly terrifying. We desperately want to believe she was a visible, cartoonish movie monster. But the reality is, she was entirely invisible right next door. Millions of people worldwide suffer from severe social withdrawal, consuming endless hours of true crime documentaries, podcasts, or violent media in the safety of their rooms. It's a common mirror of modern isolation, not a cause of violence. How does an entire community, an entire modern network, completely miss a human being slipping this far into total, lethal detachment? The frightening truth is that she wasn't noticed, because our modern systems are built to prioritize digital convenience over deep human verification. True crime documentation wasn't entertainment for Jung. It was a sterile laboratory. She spent months treating real human victims as mere objects, studying the exact mechanics of execution and disposal to step out of her invisible life by systematically destroying a successful peer out of pure, deep-seated envy. And the most terrifying reality uncovered by the digital forensic unit is that Hannah was never meant to be an isolated casualty. Police data extraction revealed that Jung had already targeted, mapped, and contacted multiple other young tutors on the matchmaking app, using the exact same maternal disguise. She was a budding serial killer in mid-execution, stopped entirely by the raw intuition of a civilian taxi driver. I cannot confidently say the first simple explanation of a localized crime works anymore. We are looking at a system that effectively allowed an anonymous predator to map out a target and walk directly into a secure home. But if platform safety architectures only protect the paying consumer while leaving the independent worker completely exposed to anonymous threats, where does the real liability end? That is the missing mechanism that cannot be ignored before we repeat the surface narrative of this case. Jung Yoo-jung used our trusted digital networks to turn an innocent person's career into an open hunting ground. If our platforms are not legally required to vet the very people using their services to track down targets, we aren't actually building true safety. We are just manufacturing a highly profitable illusion of it. We want to hear your reasoning and feedback in the comments below. Should digital marketplaces and matching applications bear direct legal accountability for fully vetting every single user on their platforms? Or does the burden of safety ultimately rest entirely on our own caution behind closed doors? Jung Yoo-jung remains behind bars, a physical cell finally matching the digital one she built for herself. But her empty room stands as a quiet, lingering warning of the invisible voids growing completely unnoticed right beside us. Do you believe the platform should be held legally responsible for Jung's actions, or was this entirely an individual failure? Let me know in the comments.